Let's talk about basic pacing. So for a few weeks, I was stuck without my computer. Very sad. And I had to rely almost entirely on an Android phone for my entertainment needs. Turns out, you can play any Ren'Py game on an Android phone. You just have an app that converts the PC build to an Android build. So I played a lot of visual novels, and I found that a lot of them had the same fundamental problem that I didn't realize was causing people grief. Basic pacing. Now, I understand that most of these indie games are not made by writers, and they can't be expected to know how to write everything, but I think it's worth learning the most fundamental parts of pacing so that your writing doesn't actively drive your player base away. The most common problem I saw was dev pacing. That would be something like the game starts and it is just incredibly slow, and there's lots of meta jokes, and the dev talks to you directly, and then there's a 9-minute long dialogue about something. And then 5 minutes later, or 10 minutes later, there will be explosions and murder and death, and someone will step in to explain the 9,000-year-long history of the war between the aliens and the elves. And it's like, what's going on? Why is this what you thought should happen now? And the answer to that is because for the dev, it's been 2 months. They've been playing their game for 2 months. They've been building it for 2 months. And so in their mind, it's been a long time since anything happened. But of course, you need to be focusing on what the player experiences, not what the dev experiences. To the player, it's been 10 minutes. Keeping your eye on the player's experience rather than the dev's experience is obviously a major part of making sure your pacing isn't terrible, but I think that there's a more fundamental thing that needs to be taught here, and that is, what is pacing and how do you use it? If you look this up, you'll find all sorts of people with different sorts of opinions, but let me tell you one that's going to be useful for visual novels specifically. You see, there is a problem with people playing video games, and that is that unless you're doing fan works, nobody cares about your setting. Nobody cares about your characters. Nobody cares about anything. They're open to playing, so they're interested in the basic idea of your game, but they don't instinctively care about what you're doing. And none of the concepts you've come up with will make them instinctively care. That's what pacing is for. Narrative pacing. What scenes go where and how long do they last? That stuff is what makes the player care about your setting. It is fundamentally the art of showing the player something cool until they realize it is cool and then moving on. Obviously, that's a gross oversimplification, but that's the most fundamental idea here. Pacing is the art of making sure the player connects to your game world. So all of the formulas that you might see where, pacing has to go like this, or pacing has to go like this, or pacing has to go like this, all of those are just specific approaches to having an audience member care about your work of art. And they talk about, emotional ups and emotional downs and all of that, and sure, you can get into all of that. But at the most fundamental level, your job is to show the players things that will make them care. And that's pacing. You just keep track of exactly what things they're supposed to care about and show them to the player in a way that works for you. So let's give you an example. Let's say that you have a specific secret or conceit that is the cornerstone of your game. Let's say that your game is actually, your neighbor is secretly an alien. It can be a really overwhelming impulse to explain the secret or the conceit to the player. In fact, many indie games open with that, like 10 minutes of the dev explaining the concept to the character, often as the dev, like in a meta commentary. But that's the worst possible thing to do. You never need to explain this stuff. In fact, you almost never need to explain anything. You will almost never need to do any kind of dump, any kind of lore dump or explaining of things or exposition. All of that stuff is unnecessary. Now, that's coming on strong. Obviously, it comes up a lot, even in good works of art. But for the sake of you trying to make your game, I strongly recommend you think of all exposition as forbidden. Just assume that you shouldn't do it. Because the moment you start to say, well, I think I can just exposit here, you're opening a gateway to being the exposition machine and explaining everything. But as I said, the player does not care. You can talk about the 9,000-year-old history of a war between elves and aliens, and the player will not care. It might be cool to you because you've imagined it, but it's not cool to the player. Now, that doesn't mean that secrets and conceits are bad. It also doesn't mean you can't do any sort of explaining. It just means that they serve a purpose different than what you might expect. You see, a secret or a conceit is the center of a whirlpool. It helps you to arrange your narrative. It gives your narrative a structure. It drives your narrative. So your secret or your conceit is what's going to create the scenes that will matter. Let's go back to the alien neighbor idea. So if you have a neighbor who is an alien, how do you make that into a driving force for your narrative instead of, just something to explain? Well, there are a lot of ways. One way to do it would be to Zim it. So in Zim style, the character is obviously an alien, but you're the only person who notices. That gives us a lot of fun ideas for scenes where, you're trying to prove that they're an alien or explain that they're an alien, and everybody else is like, you shouldn't make fun of, someone with a deformity or whatever, or they don't even see the deformity. There's something going on there. The idea there becomes more interesting the more you think about it. You can create so many scenes orbiting around that concept. You never have to explain that the neighbor is an alien. Because in the act of putting scenes together, which take advantage of the fact that the neighbor is an alien, you are already explaining it. So you can create scenes where you try and capture footage of them changing into their other forms, or where you try and get the records of their historical the birth certificate and stuff like that, or you can try and find their alien mothership in the basement, or hundreds of other things that are fun, as opposed to a 10-minute dialogue sequence where the alien says, I am from planet Glorblox 5, and I am here to study... Don't do that. That doesn't matter. That will never matter. Our concept, our conceit, allows us to create a narrative which flows according to the concept. It ties all of our narrative beats together. And this keeps us from doing things like having a scene that's, you wake up in the morning, and then you get up, and then you put on your pants, and then you open the door, and then you walk down the hall, and then you get out a bowl of Frosted Flakes, and then you pour milk on the bowl of Frosted Flakes, and then you eat. This sort of piece-by-piece writing, this straight-ahead writing, is very common in indie VNs, and it happens when you haven't thought of what you actually want to put in your game. But once you have a concept and you start to understand that that is what your game is going to orbit around, it becomes extremely easy to understand that none of this is going to matter today. It might matter some other day. Some other day you might get up and get out of bed, go down to the breakfast, make yourself breakfast, and there's an alien on your roof looking down at you or something, right? But you don't need it today, so you don't put it in today. No one's going to miss it. Your game will be much better paced if you focus on the things that make your player care about your world. Having an alien for a neighbor creates so many fun and interesting ideas that you can put into your game as scenes that the player can look at and become interested in. That's the basic idea. Now, aliens as a neighbor could be played for laughs, or it could be played for some kind of suspense, but this works for literally anything. Whether it's a secret or a conceit, it can be the driving force of your narrative without ever having to be explained. If you follow that idea, I think you will find that your basic pacing starts to emerge naturally as you start to think of things that you want to show the player, things that you think the player might like. And you say, oh, well, if we bring these things together, then this obviously happens first, and then we can do like a beat here that's fun, and then we can do this beat over here, and then we can bring it together over here. This is just basic story crafting. It's nothing special, but it is so important. you can't skip it, because otherwise you end up with this straight ahead writing where nothing ever happens, and then suddenly the dev gets bored and explains the history of an ancient war or whatever for the next 10 minutes. That is my take on basic pacing. Feel free to tell me what you think down below.